The war between Russia and Ukraine has been a relentless saga of territorial ambitions, shattered agreements and geopolitical maneuvering. As Ukraine battles to preserve its Russian, Putin has introduced a contentious proposal: the departure of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to pave the way for a transitional government. Meanwhile, accusations of Kiev breaching an agreement to halt attacks on energy facilities have further strained the fragile situation. Amid this turmoil, Washington's revised minerals agreement with Ukraine adds another layer of complexity, raising questions about the Americans' true intentions. With political tensions escalating, one question looms large: can diplomacy still salvage peace, or is the region destined for prolonged conflict? I'm Henny Saif. Let's go in depth. Donald Trump has proposed a new deal to Ukraine that offers continued U.S. support in exchange for control over Ukraine's industrial output and infrastructure. The Independent stated that the proposal demands Ukraine pay back U.S. war contributions, estimated at $130 billion, and gives the U.S. significant control over Ukraine's mineral resources, transport, and communication systems. Ukrainian lawmakers, however, have rejected the deal, calling it unconstitutional and a violation of international law. The deal forces Ukraine to choose between being a U.S. economic colony or facing Russia. Despite the offer, Ukrainian officials are determined to resist foreign domination and continue their fight for sovereignty.
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine continues to escalate, with heightened tensions stemming from recent developments involving Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and breaches of agreements related to energy facilities. Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed interest in Zelensky's departure and proposed a transitional government in Ukraine under international sponsorship. However, the White House has firmly stated that only Ukrainians should determine their governance structure, emphasizing that high-level talks with Moscow are premature. Recent efforts by the U.S. to facilitate a ceasefire have been met with skepticism, especially as both sides continue to strike infrastructure despite a temporary agreement not to target energy facilities. This agreement, intended to aid peace negotiations, has been violated by both Russia and Ukraine, with Moscow accusing Ukraine of breaching terms by attacking energy facilities aid to Ukraine, which Zelensky does not view as loans, highlighting the strategic partnership between the two nations. Meanwhile, Washington has sent a revised version of the minerals agreement to Kiev for review. This action is perceived as part of broader U.S. efforts to secure its interests in the region rather than solely focusing on achieving a ceasefire. In response to these developments, the European Union has indicated it will uphold sanctions on Russia, reflecting skepticism about Moscow's intentions. As international efforts to broker peace continue, the U.S. also pursues its strategic interests in the region. This conflict is likely to persist unless a comprehensive and mutually acceptable agreement is reached, which seems increasingly difficult given the current political climate.
Amid the chaos of war, Ukraine faces mounting pressure as Russia demands Zelensky's departure and accuses Kiev of breaching energy facility agreements. Meanwhile, U.S. diplomacy reshapes the minerals agreement, with global powers intervening. Can diplomacy untangle this web of conflict and pave the way for resolution, or deepen the divide? Ladies and gentlemen, for more analysis, we are joined by Mr. Oleksiy Melnik, the former Ukraine Deputy Defense Minister from Kiev, and we're also joined by Ms. Olga Krasniak, an international relations professor from Moscow. Thank you very much for joining us here on In Depth. Now, Mr. Milnik, to what extent is the US pursuing its own strategic interests in the region beyond simply seeking an end to the Ukraine conflict? And what are its primary goals in the region?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. I don't think that the current policy of Trump's administration is aimed at the US national interests. It's rather something in interpretation of Donald Trump, what he thinks that the US national security interests, because the demand he imposed on Ukraine are simply unacceptable for Ukraine. And also the radical change in American position towards Russian-Ukrainian war is not what can be understood either in Ukraine or among other Ukrainian partners. That's why I would probably doubt that now the American administration is guided by the US national interests.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Krasniak, how might Putin's proposal, with obviously the departure of Vladimir Zelensky, affect Ukraine's political landscape, and what are the potential implications for Ukrainian sovereignty then?
The question of Ukrainian sovereignty, I think it's the main issue because from Moscow perspective, Ukraine has no sovereignty at all. And having sovereignty, it means making its own decisions regarding foreign and domestic policy and being independent and being backed some resources, people, capacity, so basically by many things. And it is something what a country can put forward and just to strengthen its sovereignty. And Ukraine lacks any of it. So, and in this case, we would not consider Ukraine as a sovereign state. And taking into account this more than 3 years of war, when Ukraine was totally dependent, it's still totally dependent on the United States and European Union. And now we see America changed its attitude because for America, Ukraine is taken as a burden. And what America is interested, it's like a more stable world affairs. And in providing this stability, Russia is one of the key players, and America is interested, I believe, to normalize relations with Russia for the sake of global stability. And Ukraine, you see, is not on the agenda for American interests.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Milnik, from your opinion, what are the broader geopolitical consequences of the US gaining control over Ukraine's industrial output and mineral resources?
I don't see any logic behind Donald Trump's demands regarding Ukrainian natural resources or Ukrainian nuclear power plants, critical infrastructure, because they simply fail to understand that at a certain moment in this equation of risks, either saying yes or no to American demands, the choice that it will be unacceptable anymore for Ukraine, even regarding all the consequences, like seizing American military support, that saying yes would be even more damaging for Ukraine. And I think we are like probably threshold at very critical moment for Ukrainian leadership.
Mm-hmm. Nick, how does Putin's approach to the conflict reflect Russia's broader vision or strategic interests for the whole region?
Indeed, Russia is interested in also in stability in the Eurasian region, and Ukraine is a critical part of Russia's safety and stability from security purposes, given some historical issues and given this social-cultural connections which we have with Ukraine, with Ukrainian people. And we definitely see that Kiev regime or Zelensky regime, they probably making not so smart decisions. And I believe for safety and stability, and maybe basically for keeping Ukraine as a state, or maybe the rest of what is left from Ukraine, it would be to keep good relations, or maybe reapproach to Russia with good with Russia. That would be the only guarantee. It is something what Vladimir Putin suggests, not just only suggests, but puts forward as this narrative and this attitude. So having good relations with Russia, this is the only guarantee that Ukraine would remain a stable country and basically will recover from this situation.
Mr. Milnik, why has there been skepticism regarding the US efforts to facilitate a ceasefire, particularly from the Russian perspective as well?
What we heard already from our Russian guest is another portion of Russian propaganda regarding security guarantees by the aggressor state, which actually Ukrainian, not just independence, but Ukrainian nation and very right of Ukrainians to exist as an independent nations. And the biggest problem that we face now, that the American administration is actually, at least on this stage, is supporting Russian narratives. And instead of imposing pressure on the aggressor side, for some reasons, President Trump is trying to force Ukraine to more and more concessions. And as I said, there are certain limits when Ukraine will have to choose either to lose one of the critical Ukrainian partners or to listen what Donald Trump says and to accept something that is not acceptable. And I'm sure that Ukraine is a sovereign state, despite critical dependence on the foreign assistance, which is absolutely understandable because we are facing or we're fighting against the enemy, overmanned, and with resources, enormous Russian resources invested in this war. That's why Ukraine definitely needs foreign support, but Ukraine does not follow any demands or advices by our international partners.
Ms. Krasniak, tell us what you think. Is the alleged disagreement between Russia and the US over sanctions relief a minor tactical or a technical issue, or does it reveal a more fundamental divergence in their approaches to resolving the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, indeed, it's a very good question because during the time of this conflict, more than 3 years, Russia is under heavy sanctions pressure, economic pressure, and the Russia economy is very resistant. And by the end, so now we're top 4 world economies for GDP, for many different elements of these statistics. So, and of course, sanctions relief, it is can be taken as a positive attitude if it will happen. But also, I do not believe that Russian government just for this approach or maybe hopes for this approach because well if the relief sanction relief will happen, well, I think it would be a positive moment. If not, we're already resistant, so we already managed to develop and economically and technologically and militarily without this connection, scientific technological connections with Western countries. So and the negotiations which are taking place, I believe partially they touch upon sanctions issues, but what we see as a fact, so Donald Trump, he prolonged the sanctions just recently. So he did not impose new sanctions, but he did prolong sanctions which have been taking place previously. So I think, yes, some relief maybe partially can happen, but still it has no critical implications on our economy.
Mr. Milnik, what alternatives does Ukraine really have to resist both the US economic dominance and Russia?
This war is a war of necessity for Ukraine. This is not the war of chance, unlike for the Russian Federation, because Russia, President Putin can stop this war. I mean, not the war as such, because he is not in a full control of the current conflict, but at least he can order his troops to leave Ukrainian territory, and then we another stage of negotiations peace negotiations. But for Ukraine, as you said, we have very limited choices. Either we accept demands from two sides, from the Kremlin and from the White House, and surrender, or we keep fighting. And up until now, I think that Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society are not ready to make such a decision. So we are eager for peace, but not peace at any price.
Ms. Krasniak, what is the significance of the European Union's decision to uphold sanctions on Russia in the context of Putin's actions?
Well, European position, or the position of European Union, I think it's very specific. It's very peculiar because in the recent decades after World War II, Europe somehow gave up its military protection for the sake of American protection. And in this case, an ability of European countries to make some strategic decisions is also limited because American influence is huge. And in the last decade, almost 80 years. So, and in this case, whatever European countries they see, they have a lot of limitations, and for the foremost would be economic limitations. In all these political narratives, or maybe all this rhetoric, political rhetoric, which comes from European countries, we should acknowledge it has no substantial ground, because European capacity is kind of limited. And puts themselves in a very limited position, being dependent strategically on the United States. Of course, carefully so what Europeans say, but we need to look what they're doing actually. And the doers, they kind of, maybe they do not follow all this political rhetoric.
Mr. Milnik, how does the expanded European support for Ukraine alter the balance of power in the conflict? How hopeful is Ukraine of the European support?
As for the moment, we see growing understanding among our European partners and some very positive steps in the direction of continuing support for Ukraine and strengthening the support for Ukraine. And I think that the most critical actually question for Ukraine regarding American support is not the percentage of military assistance provided for Ukraine, but some items like air defense systems, Patriot air defense system, that in case if the United States of America decide to block providing Ukraine with anti-rocket systems, then most of the damage would be done not to the troops on the front line, but on the civilian cities. What we see almost every night is terrorist attacks on Ukrainian cities, on civilian infrastructure. But again, as I said, we don't have too many choices. And Europe now is making not just very strong declarations, but some practical steps. And what I would agree with our Moscow guest, that Europe was not preparing for war with Russia, which actually against the Russian propaganda that saw Ukraine as a military threat, Europe as a military threat, that now they acknowledge that Europe was not preparing for the war, but they actually made Europe to militarize themselves, they make Ukraine to militarize themselves, and only the matter of time and political will that one day we will be fully ready to deter Russian aggression. But again, this is the matter of time and matter of resources.
Ms. Krasniak, I want to ask you one more question about the European position now. To what extent do you believe the EU stance on sanctions relief is a coordinated strategy to undermine the US-Russia talks? Or do you see it as simply a reflection of the bureaucratic inertia within the European Commission?
Well, from European Union perspective, so relieving economic sanctions against Russia, it would be a very complicated issue from many positions, from many aspects, not just only from a bureaucratic point of view, but also from some value point of view, because European countries they promote these liberal values, so they do not look at the world politics as a real politics, and they basically they still, I think, they in a kind of an illusion of some promoting liberal values when they look at Russia as on the opposite point of view. So, and in this case, still the same like with America, we're not seeking and we're not looking that Europe will relieve some sanctions. So it will happen. Well, that's fine. If it's not, so it's because we see European countries in a recession, an economic recession now, and basically they from welfare to warfare, and so it would lead to some negative attitude for European countries. But we will see. But still. Again, so we're not seeking that European countries they would relieve some sanctions. If they would, that's fine.
Mr. Milnik, one final question now. The shift from free aid to loans, as mentioned, is an increasing trend. Now, what are the long-term implications of Ukraine's growing debt burden, particularly in the concerning the healthcare and the essential public services?
Yes, indeed, it's a very big, serious challenge for Ukraine because due to behavior of our big neighbor, the last 3 years, almost the whole Ukrainian budget is spent on the healthcare, pensions, other social expenditures are actually funded by our external partners. Therefore, if Ukraine needs to buy now these missiles for cities, civilian infrastructure, Ukraine has to find this money somewhere. And here, the only source, because Ukrainian economy has been damaged also to the very high extent, the only source is external, either provide borrowing money on the foreign markets. So the choice is not very pleasant.
Yes. Mr. Alexei Milnik, the former Ukraine Deputy Defense Minister, and Ms. Olga Krasniak, the International Relations Professor, thank you very much for joining us on In Depth. Now, as the shadows of the conflict deepen, Russia and the US remain locked in a high-stakes geopolitical chess game, with Washington's strategic maneuvering who's going to call checkmate first. Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for joining us.